You talked about retrofitting in there. Retrofitting is our next topic. How do you deliver net zero in buildings designed for a different age? To tell us, we have a trio of speakers from JLL's maintenance business Integral, Shane Betts, Alan Epps and David Bownass.
So, thank you very much everybody. My name is Shane Betts and I am the head of our corporate accounts division within Integral, as described part of JLL's maintenance self-delivery business across the UK. And I have with me...
Hello, I'm David Bownass. I run the net zero carbon design team for JLL.
And I'm Alan Epps. I look after the Intelligent Operations Centre and we bring all the bits together to make it right.
Okay, so we're doing something a little bit different today. The aim is that we're just going to have a bit of a conversation. I'm going to fire some questions at these guys for them to give you some answers based upon those conversations rather than give you more slides. Okay, so our marketing department's decided this would be a nice alternative to slides. So we'll see how it goes. Okay. Initially, my role as head of corporate accounts, again, like I say, we did try to get David to grow a beard, apparently wasn't into it. So Alan's jacket is all the entertainment you get, I'm afraid. So as my role as part of Integral is we talk to a lot of those investor occupied clients, some of those that Tim mentioned and put on his initial slide, about their challenges, what they're facing in the next, between now and 2030, all those topics discussed at COP27. And thankfully, I was going to talk a little bit about hybrid, but Tim did that for me and the challenges faced there. So that is the reality, that return to workspace, skeptical C-suites about how they're going to manage that in the future. We know that journey. That's one of the big challenges that clients are talking to us about and are asking us about how do we deliver that. And that's both in the investor space, because the investors are nervous about, to that point, if 40% of people don't return, what do they do with that space and how do we best manage that? The second behind-the-scenes challenge that, again, COP27 focused on is net zero carbon. Lots of organisations have made big commitments, 2030, 2040, 2050, depending on where they are. But at the moment, they're commitments. We know that people are not delivering upon those commitments at the rate that they need to. So one of the things that we need to look at is how do we deliver that? We can all talk about the what. Everyone's set a strategy, everyone's set a plan at a high level, but how do they physically deliver that? Which hopefully where some of these guys will help us. Okay. We know that 80% of the real estate that we occupy today will still be there in 2050. So we need to ultimately look at how do we manage that space, how do we retrofit that space to meet those hybrid demands that occupiers and investors are looking for, and make sure that the operations of the building is effective compared to the utilisation of the building. And we also know that 40% of carbon emissions globally comes from real estate. So that's where retrofitting comes in. I think and we know that rising energy costs has driven the increased pace associated with retrofitting, but we're still only operating at a third of retrofitting pace that we need to hit 2030 targets. So we need to accelerate that. The challenge is we are not going to be able to accelerate that by simply throwing more work at the construction industry, because they will not have the capacity. Our project world, our construction world will not have the capacity to deliver net zero if we are just doing more, but without using data and leveraging the information we have. So, excuse me, so on that basis, the key question, as I say, is how. How do we use data? Data is the key to this. Andy very articulated smart buildings and how we need to get better information out of buildings, both new buildings and existing buildings. So how do we use the data? How do we start to drive smart, intelligent decisions, to make the right decisions, to drive asset management, drive life cycle maintenance, and look at how we can best utilise buildings going forward? Okay, so this is where I start to ask questions of the guys, and I'm just facilitating, which is a nice, easy bit. So I suppose the first question, I'm going to go to David because he's our retrofitting net zero expert within JLL Integral, is what does retrofitting really mean and why now?
Okay, thanks. I think you've touched on the why now piece, because we know we're about a third behind in terms of the speed of retrofit where we are, and there are literally millions of buildings that need to be addressed. We've carried out now probably hundreds of net zero carbon audits for a variety of different clients, some of the investor clients that we spoke about before, and some occupier clients. You tend to find that your retrofit falls down into sort of three key categories. The easy wins, along the lines of the items we've spoken about, BMS, controls, LED lighting, bigger interventions next in terms of removing fossil fuels and changing the technologies and changing the MEP systems. And then the third topic is one that's perhaps not touched on. Most of our clients tend not to get involved. It's a bit more complicated, and that's really around helping tenants reduce their loads. And there's a variety of components to that, but that's always really linked to change management within those organisations. But I think the most important part in terms of the data, I'm astounded by how little data clients have when we get hold of projects, to the extent that sometimes they don't even have drawings or red line boundaries of buildings. So there is a huge gap between some of the conversations that we've heard and what you can do, and the reality of what we see to be able to start our works in terms of net zero carbon.
Fantastic, thanks. So in terms of data, Al, how can we get hold of that data, and what does retrofitting support and underpin with data?
So we've been training engineers for a number of years to look at it from condition reporting, and what we're doing now is using that information to then drive into pre-retrofit. So where we're looking at 10 similar pumps, we're able to take data out sort of temperature, vibration, load, run that back against the OEMs, and then we're able to provide that to complement the work when it goes forward, to make sure that we are only changing the parts that are needed. So we're able to use it as a selection tool at the very beginning, which we can then use to validate the selection on retrofitting rather than replacing. It allows us to change components rather than systems.
Okay. I suppose I'm going to throw one that I didn't ask you earlier, actually. So, in terms of where Tim talked about 40% of people potentially not return to the office, how are we considering that in our retrofit journey?
Actually, when I was listening to that presentation, I think it's very, very true that there is a shift to quality. All of the work that we're seeing realistically is, in offices in particular, is around a shift to quality within key development areas, so London, Manchester, Glasgow, Edinburgh. And one of the areas that we've got a lot of work in the recent past is really around transactions. So when investor clients are looking to buy buildings, then we spend quite a bit of time pre-transaction assessing those buildings from an ESG, net zero carbon viewpoint, to try and understand what's required, what the cost is to transition the building. So I think it's absolutely true that, and we see it in our own graduates when they come to start, there is absolutely a shift to quality, and I think there's an expectation there'll be a split in the market. So you've got quality products and you've got products that fall behind and become stranded.
Okay. And then Al, from a data perspective, how are we operationalising some of that data to drive occupancy and building efficiency?
So as per the previous presentation, we're able to take that as triggers. So we're able to run buildings now on demand using data. Now, with that for if we know that we've got a lower demand, we can then right size. So we can use the data, we can start to predict what the levels will be in there, and then we can make sure that we're replacing stuff with the new load that our models are able to select.
Okay, thank you very much. So next question is about regulation changes and codes of practice. This is David's sweet spot. How do you see regulations, codes of practice, and more governmental legislative changes enforcing and accelerating what we need to do from a retrofit perspective? Okay,
I think there's I realise after we start a conversation around net zero carbon and people talk about it glibly and we don't always understand what it means. So very, very quickly, if you want your building to be net zero carbon, you'll need to reduce the energy demand significantly to a level that very, very broadly and quickly has some correspondence to the amount of renewable energy we're going to have in 2050 as a country. In the process of retrofitting, you'll need to calculate all of the embodied carbon in the materials, and once you've done both of those, you then need to supply the building with renewable energy and buy out the embodied carbon or buy carbon offsets to address the embodied carbon. So that all sounds, there's a huge amount of detail tucked away in there. I won't bore you with that right now. But there are different industry standards at the moment, which is quite confusing. We have standards in the UK, we have European standards that global investors use, and it's a bit of a muddle. However, coming forwards, there is a net zero carbon building standard being developed by industry, which should be out at the end of this year, because currently there are no, in the strictest sense, there are no existing building net zero carbon standards to build to. Most of the standards are focused around new build, and that new product should address that for us. And the other one, I think, the key one is, in 2050, building regulations are meant to change, so they're going to regulate new buildings, and that makes a big difference, because industry standards tend to be addressed by those key super prime projects and not the majority of buildings. So regulating through building regs impacts everybody's buildings, and that's both new and existing. So changes are coming to that. I think also it's just worth mentioning that that issue around embodied carbon, as opposed to operational carbon, is growing all the time. At the moment, it's relatively cheap compared to your retrofit to buy out your embodied carbon, but those costs are set to increase significantly. So we will have regulation, industry standards that address both operational energy and carbon, embodied carbon, and I think very quickly after that, we will have building reg standards that start to do that for us as well.
Perfect, cool. So lots to come then. I suppose moving to Alan a little bit, in terms of technology, and we've talked a little bit there about improving operational efficiency, and I think, David, you talk about the fact that you have quick wins, you know, whether that's calibration of equipment, etc. The reality is quick wins require a lot of intervention, a lot of maintenance, a lot of ongoing calibration. So how can the smart systems Andy talked about in the previous presentation, retrofitting buildings with some of that smart technology, enable us to continually operate buildings efficiently to enable retrofitting further down the line and effective retrofitting?
But we're not trying to replace the engineers. What we're trying to do is just give them the digital toolkit. We're able to use the data, and it will give you an event, and it will go back over weeks and months and years for some of our longer clients. So we're now able to look at the data from an operational point of view to see, is it still within the parameters? That allows us to move away from the old school rounds where you'd constantly go back and you'd look at something on a weekly, daily basis, and only look at stuff that's actually running outside of the parameters. So that's what makes the changes to the operations. You're able to use the data in the tools and the data that comes out of the platforms to then focus your engineering resources and your operational resources to actually, when it's starting to run outside of its parameters, and then make a quicker interaction.
Just add a point to that, and forgive me, I probably missed it before. Once you've got your building to whatever the net zero carbon requirements are, you have to, if you want to maintain a certification on that, you have to maintain that minimum level or maximum level of energy demand across the rest of the working life of that building, or else it won't be net zero carbon. And clearly from an investor viewpoint, that has a significant benefit. So part of the, besides all of the normal things that we've spoken about, you need to ensure that you're maintaining that low energy consumption in that building for perpetuity.
Cool, thank you very much. So I suppose, you know, that's all the questions from me, which is good. I suppose one of the things that, again, Tim highlighted earlier is, you know, if you take, what should people be taking away from today? So in terms of, from your perspective, David, what do you think people should be taking away today and potentially looking at doing differently going forward to help us as an industry move forward?
Very quickly, I think it's a case of making a start, even if you don't have the data. You probably know what, and we've discussed a number of things that you need to do. But the quick wins that we spoke about are where every investor I know is starting to make a move on, because it's relatively straightforward and has a relatively straightforward payback. It's not the level of investment that other components need. So my takeaway will be there is you probably 15, 20, 25% of the energy demand in your building today can be achieved relatively quickly with minimum cost with improved control. Okay.
And Al, from a data perspective?
But when it comes down to data, it's more just look, rather than focusing on the data, there's been lots of different pilots and systems, and FM has continually played with different areas, we now need to get to a point where we move to outcomes. So we work out what we're going to do and what we're going to achieve, and then work backwards. There's a myriad of technology that's out there, and each one of them can slot into the outcome, but if you aim for the outcome first and then work back on the technology, it will achieve, rather than running it as standalone.
Okay, thank you. I suppose that's everything from me, and in terms of questions. And so we've got 2 minutes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So is there any questions that anybody wants to put to David, to Alan?
So I forgot what I was going to say now. It was really just actually a question about probably the last 2 presentations, but I think Martin touched on it a bit as well. It was really an overall, and it might be more of a discussion than a question. The implementing of the smart technologies and the application of some of the analysis you've talked about with assets, about, is it the correct asset for the replacement and so on and so forth. Are we talking about this application on existing buildings? Is it always going to be something we can do on the refurb? Or in Mark's case, is it, the principle of it will only be easily implemented on a new building? Again, talking back this morning, we've talked about BIM, and I've had long conversations with colleagues where really the best way to implement BIM is on a brand new building, but we're not going to pull our existing buildings down and build new ones. So how easy is all this technology to apply to existing portfolios?
It's more fun, I'll give it that. I would say it's more complementary. So what we can do now is, and like the last presentation, we don't need to rely on the BMSs to get the data outputs. So what we do, and I've got a whole team that does, we can analyse a building and look for where the gaps are of what a new building will be able to give out. That's where we put in IoT sensors. We don't need to rely on a BMS provider. We've got a big scale, and we can put the sensors into more locations. They're quicker, they're faster, they're easier, and we've got a lot of. I'm not too sure whether it's the right terminology or you're allowed to call them. We've got a lot of geeky engineers that really like kind of playing with that kind of areas. So these are the guys that've got smart building kind of stuff at home, so smart thermostats, and they want to see it in their work environment. So adding that to the existing can be done. It's a little bit more tricky because you've got lots of disparative systems and you're trying to bring them all back together again. But go back, if you focus on what the outcomes are, you can build something. It's easy to get the investors at the beginning to agree, but it is just as possible to bring an old building up. And actually the old buildings, that's where we get the bigger case studies, that's where we get the bigger savings, that's where we get the bigger impact, because you're taking something that's old and you're just kind of adding smart to it. But it is a little bit more of a headache in designing it.
Okay, but I think it's very important that Alan talked there about it's the gaps that you need to identify. What are the data gaps we currently have based on existing portfolios? That will be a continuum. Some buildings are almost there, some buildings are nowhere near. And I think one of the things that, in terms of the why now and how does data help now, is because the cost of overlaying this IoT approach now is far more cost effective. Those returns on investment based on energy costs, based on the rising inflation we're seeing, and also that premium space and how we deliver net zero targets, means that actually this is a more cost effective solution than it was 5-6 years ago. So as a consequence, I think retrofit now and retrofit of both data systems and BI analytics, as well as retrofit of assets within their life cycle, is becoming a far more cost-effective solution as technologies move on and move further forward. I think that's it.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
I think that's it, yeah. So please, thank you to the guys from...